On May 25th this year, George Floyd, a 46-year-old American citizen and also member of the black community, was brutally killed by a white policeman on the streets of Minneapolis in Minnesota. In more than 8-minute film, the eyes all over the world could witness Floyd pleading for last minutes of air as he was suffocating under the knee of the policeman. What can be said about excessive use of force implemented by policemen in the US today? What can be said about racial profiling and law enforcement in the United States? How widespread and big is this phenomenon? And what are the reforms that can be implemented in the police today? My name is Adi Kantor. I'm a research associate in the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS Tel Aviv, and I had the privilege to discuss these issues and more with Miss Simone Weichselbaum, who is an investigative journalist located in New York City, covering exactly these issues. I invite you to join this talk. And today I'm very honored and privileged to have with me on the show a very brave and dedicated investigative journalist joining us from New York City today, Miss Simone Weichselbaum. Hello, Simone.
Hello.
I'd like to introduce you to our guests. Of course, Simone is an investigative writer in the Marshall Project, which is a nonpartisan and nonprofit news organization aiming to create and sustain a sense of national urgency about the US criminal justice system. So Simone focuses on issues relating to federal law enforcement and local policing in the US. She spent more than 17 years reporting on a variety of urban criminal justice systems. And previously, she was working as a staff writer for the New York Daily News and the Philadelphia Daily News. Simone holds a graduate degree in criminology from the University of Pennsylvania. And last but not least, and I think probably the most interesting on a personal note, she has a very interesting background. She comes from a mixed background. She's half German Jewish, right? Your father comes from Germany, he's German Jewish, and you're also half Jamaican. So Simone Weichselbaum, I think, in her articles, in what she writes, she really speaks also for the Jewish community in the US and also for the Black community in the US. And this is very unique. So I think all of us in the INSS are very privileged to have you on our show today. So thank you so much for joining us today and for agreeing to share your thoughts with us today.
Well, thank you for the great introduction.
So, Simone, when I was thinking about what would be the first question I'd like to ask you, also after our preparation talk last week, I remembered a very, I think a sentence, a quote from you that you said, I was asking you, one of the questions I asked you is, Simone, so why do you do what you do? Or why choose journalism on top of all other professions? And you said a sentence that I think is remarkable and unforgettable. You said, Adi, I'm not there for the headlines. I'm not there for the scoop. I want to create a change, a real change in society. And I think that's a wonderful sentence to start with. And to ask you if there was a moment in time in your biography, both as a woman, as a Jewish woman, as a Black woman, growing up, being born in the US, when was the moment where it was clear for you, I'm going to be an investigative writer, focusing on police and on very sensitive issues like violence in the police and law enforcement? Was there a specific event that made it clear for you that's what you want to do?
I've always gravitated to writing about law enforcement and criminal justice, but as a young reporter in Philadelphia, I had great editors there, and they let me, I was like 23, 24 years old, and they let me go to town. And one of the first big stories I did there was a very sad story about a Black family whose mother worked in criminal justice. She was a probation officer, and her son got a scholarship to go to a very fancy private school. And one day he was in his neighborhood, which was like a lower income neighborhood. He bumped a kid in the corner store, and the kid shot and killed him. and his killer, I believe, was 12 years old. And as I started reporting that out, I learned that in Philadelphia, at least, the juvenile justice system is a lot different than the adult justice system. And this young man had a lot of brushes with the law. And because he was a little boy, basically, he was never like held for a long time in jail or prison, which a lot of advocates would say, of course, you don't want to hold a little boy in jail or prison. But he ended up shooting and killing a real rising star in young Philadelphia. That story led for me to get a public service scholarship at the University of Pennsylvania for criminology, because it was that story where I realized that America's criminal justice system is broken. That you have even an idea of reforming, like let's create a juvenile justice system, right? We shouldn't treat kids like adults. But as I learned in that story, it was underfunded, understaffed, it was under-resourced, and this young man slipped through the cracks, ended up killing someone who was very special to a lot of people. So from that point on, I realized that, you know, it's more than just the headlines or the scoop, that America really has a big problem when it comes to the law, basically.
Thank you so much for this answer. This exactly leads me to the second question I'd like to ask you. I'd like to bring us back. Now, you said you point on a problem, that there is a problem in the U.S. We watch the news, we see what is happening out there in the streets all over the U.S. And now we know that it's not happening only in the U.S. This is a worldwide, globe, all over the demonstrations, all over the globe. I want to return us to a moment in time, a month and a half ago, to the 25th of May, 2020, and to very specific 8 minutes and 48 seconds, where you were watching George Floyd being murdered in front of all of our eyes, in front of the cameras, on the TVs all over the world. When you were watching this, when you, Simone, the journalist who is specializing on issues of violence in the police in the US, law enforcement and criminal justice, what were your initial thoughts? What were the first thoughts going through your mind when this was first out there in the media?
But I want to say I've never watched the whole video. I find it grotesque and disturbing. And from covering this, I have seen way too many Black men die on the hands of law enforcement in video after video now for almost 10 years. So I try now not to watch these things. But when I read the story, it broke the morning after Memorial Day. So it was a 3-day weekend. And at the Marshall Project, we have daily meetings. And for the most part, we've all been consumed with coronavirus stories and coming up with coronavirus stories. And all the, like, we thought that was our crisis to deal with in America, right? Coronavirus, it's terrible. It impacts everybody. Sure. And we have Slack. I don't know if Israel, you guys have Slack, but Slack is everywhere now in corporate America. So I had Slacked the story so everyone could see it. And we always had this debate up until that point. What story will like knock coronavirus off the front pages? Like what story in criminal justice is worth us chasing? Because all of us were focused on the coronavirus and its very big impact on the criminal justice system here in the US. And I said that story, like I read the story about the video, I didn't want to watch it, but he dies. He's killed on video and he's handcuffed. He's incapacitated. The cop who's doing it has this really blank stare, like a serial killer. So then it was a debate, should we jump into it? Because, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, these big papers with a bigger staff, what will they do? But then I remembered, I've been covering police reform for so long, that Minneapolis actually was the darling of police reform for a while. They had an openly gay female police chief. They had the Department of Justice come in. She asked the Department of Justice to come in and review that police department. So I knew they were trying to reform. And so the story I had pitched was, why don't we look at the failed reforms? Like what happened to Minneapolis? It was supposed to be a star. And that was the first story we did, which got a lot of hits. And usually when I write about police reform, it doesn't get a lot of hits. It's wonky, it's boring, it's about police policy. I joke with my friends, I feel like I'm the Anthony Fauci of police reform. Now people want to talk to me, where for years no one gave two shits what I was writing about. I don't write about policing from like the racial justice beat, which is very popular in the US. I don't write about policing from the crime beat, like gangs and MS-13, which is also very popular in the US. I write about it from a policy point of view. Like what is broken in US policing? And there's a lot.
So this leads me now to the third question. What is broken from your eyes, from what you see? I want to explain to our audience. You get to meet cops and chief police, and you get to interview these people. And you go also to very, I would say, very dangerous, maybe dangerous is not the right word, but problematic areas. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to do what you do. You come across these people, and what do you hear? What do they tell you? Where is the problem, and why do you think it's happening now? Why is it?
No, it's not now. It was always happening.
We know that it was there all along, but now it's out there. Now there's a lot more attention, both in the media, all over the world. I mean, look what happened. It started in Minneapolis, and there was a chain reaction all over the world. I cover Europe. I can tell you in Germany, in Berlin, there were mass demonstrations demonstrating for the memory of George Floyd. So I want to return us back now to what you, from your eyes, when you go into those police departments, when you interview those cops, if I would ask you to point at the problem, what's the problem from your eyes? Where is it?
Well, there's many problems, right? So the issue, where should I begin? Well,
maybe we should start from excessive use of force. I think that's an interesting direction to answer this question. You in your last article, I referred to the last article that you wrote about excessive use of force, where policemen tend to use more force than they're supposed to. Where do you think this comes from?
Well, the American law. So to answer the question why it's broken, the U.S. courts and a lot of state laws sort of write on the books that police officers can act one way versus the rest of us. So that's the first problem. And it's everywhere. So in the use of force case, it's this idea of resisting arrest in many states in the US is a crime. So even if you start saying, I'm innocent, I didn't do anything, you get angry, the cop gets angry, a shove happens, very quickly it can escalate. And most often than not, you as the person, the civilian, will be the one charged, not the cop, right? Even if he hit you, that's just how it works. And it's not just with excessive force. The U.S. courts also protect cops, for example, this idea of second guessing them. So there's a very big Supreme Court case from, I believe, the 1980s that says that more or less you can't second guess a cop. If a reasonable officer in that same position thinks that cop acted as such and it was a good idea for him to taser you, shove you in the wall, shoot you, whatever, the court more or less will side. What you have to do as a defense attorney is prove that what that cop did was not reasonable. And that's very hard to do. You have to prove that that cop violated someone's constitutional rights. And that's very hard to do. It definitely happens, but it's happens more less than it should, basically.
So do these cases come at all to court? I mean, can it be then
Yeah, they do. So there's a lot of issues. Number one, in America, we have a civil court system, right? You can sue for damages, and we have a criminal court system. So very unlikely is a police officer going to be charged criminally. It happens sometimes, like George Floyd. There was another case in Minneapolis, which was very racially charged, of a Somali American officer who shot and killed a white yoga teacher from Australia. He was convicted, again, very rarely. But Philando Castile, that was a person shot outside Minneapolis who had a gun. He had every right to carry his gun. A Latino officer shot and killed him in front of his, I believe, his fiance. And she Facebook Lived that incident. He got off. So the first issue is proving wrongdoing by a cop in a criminal setting really happens. The second part, which is more what we focus on here in the States, is suing. Like, can I sue a police department? Can I sue a police officer? When people get millions of dollars in settlements, Chicago, New York City, they pay millions of dollars a year in police abuse cases, right? Cops are rarely sent to prison, but cities pay out a lot of money.
Why are they so rarely sent to prison? What's the reason behind this? Who's protecting them? Now I'm coming to the question also, who's protecting them? And also, who is being protected by the police? Who's protecting who?
Well, there's this idea, right, that if you are a government official we call it acting in the color of law, is in our legal standard here in the U.S. I have on my badge, I am sworn to protect, the Constitution. I have a gun. I'm trained. I'm putting that in air quotes, everyone. I'm trained. I know what I'm doing. And I'm chasing after a bad guy, a guy with a gun, a guy who just killed someone, a guy who, I don't know, hijacked a car. And I beat that guy up to get him arrested. Of course, right? I'm acting in the color of law. Why should I go to jail for beating that bad guy up, right? That's the thinking. However, as we see, a lot of the time, the cop is scared. He shoots the person, and sometimes they make up why they shot the person. The cop doesn't like that you challenged him. That was our last story. This is how often rough arrests happen. They don't like to be challenged. They get pissed off. They punch you in the face.
For example, if someone refuses an arrest, this
you don't want to
interpreted by the cop as okay, he refused. Now I have a justification to use force.
Correct.
The question is, what happens when the use of force is above? So the question is, what is normal? I mean, any use of force is questionable in a way, right? There's a law here. This is democracy. They cannot just do what they want. But yet we find many cases in which you're writing about in your articles of there's situation where there is the law and there's the cop who has his own law.
There was a big protest. Those cops were charged like very quickly. Rarely happens in America. Meanwhile, a case that I told you about, Breonna Taylor, a female Black woman in her 20s, an EMT, just in her bed sleeping, and the cops kick down the wrong door and shoot and kill her in her bed. This happened like a week before George Floyd. It got attention here in the US. Clearly, globally, people don't know what I'm talking about. It got to the point where Beyonce, everyone knows who Beyonce is, had to push the governor of that state to arrest that cop. The cop was fired.
Yeah, they were.
That cop is not arrested.
They were entering a woman's house without a warrant, just entering a house of a.
They call it no-knock warrant.
She was a Black woman.
A Black woman. They had a warrant. In some states, again, it's America. Remember, it's 50 states, right? So New York, we're liberal. We're not Kentucky where this happened. We're not Minnesota. We're not Alabama. New York, California, where a lot of Jewish people, you didn't live, right? We live in very liberal states.
Yes.
I'm talking about places that are not like New York, okay? Yes. So where this lady was killed is not in New York. So this cop, they have no-knock warrants, which means you can kick down the door without announcing yourself as a police officer. So they did that. That's been banned in a lot of states by now. And it was a lot of political pressure to get this cop to lose his job. He's not arrested. The cop is now suing to get his job back, which we would say in New York, it's so chutzpahdik, right? You shoot and kill someone, there's protests about it, and you're suing to get your job back? Really? like, okay. So it's just each state has its own politics. That's a state. Mitch McConnell, he runs our Senate here. It's a very controversial figure. That's his state.
I'm really interested to hear from you if there's one of the biggest challenges that you're faced with when you go there. What would you say is the biggest? I would ask you two questions. What would you say is the biggest challenge that you're faced with, and what are the presents or the not advantage, but really the good things?
You say privilege.
Yeah. What are the privileges that you gain from being who you are, from coming from such a fascinating background that is so particular and so specific to you? What are the challenges, but also the advantages of being who you are and doing what you do?
Well, I want to say that the shout out to my employer, the Marshall Project. I've been there from the beginning, and we're named after Thurgood Marshall, the first Supreme Court Justice of color.
Yes.
And why are we named after him? We are named after him because as a young attorney, he would travel the country looking for cases to highlight, hoping it could bring it to the Supreme Court, mainly focus on lynching. So he was very picky of what cases he would go and fight for, because his goal was to get it to the Supreme Court. The Marshall Project was founded in his legacy. We are very picky of what stories we pour our energy into. There's a lot of things. I cover policing. Several of my colleagues cover prisons and jails. We look at prosecutors, judges, a lot to look at in criminal justice. And as the main police reporter, I can't cover everything that's broken in policing.
Of course.
We have to be very strategic. So when the time I decide to go there, I've reported out the story. I've figured out like who to talk to. Like I go through court documents, data sets. The time I land in a city, I'm like a expert on that problem. And I'm coming in with a lot of resources. I'm coming from New York. I'm coming from what some people call an elite journalism outlet. I'm not just showing up. I'm not a freelancer. So I'm coming in with resources. I'm coming with a photographer, a videographer, right? Like
you are a researcher at heart.
100%. I always say every story I do is like a graduate level thesis because it is. I can tell you that. So the time I land there, we have a plan, right? I'm not wandering just for the hell of it.
Of course.
And we tend to meet with the people who run a city or run that system. Most people, when we first started, it was hard to get people to meet with me. They didn't know who we are, but now we've been around 6 years. You know, thank God I've been getting access. So as far as getting sort of, we call the stakeholders, the people at the table making these decisions to talk, isn't so difficult. What's hard is getting people on the ground to talk. And because I'm mixed, I always say, you guys don't know what Dominican or Puerto Rican is, or maybe you do, but I guess for Israel, people always think I'm like Yemeni or Moroccan.
Interesting.
Right? They don't know what I am.
Yeah.
So when I deal with openly white racist people in law enforcement, they look at the last name, they'll be like, oh, you're Jewish. They'll ask me something like, did Jesus have horns? Because Jews have horns.
So this is
explain to that.
For anti-Semitism in your work, of course.
Oh, all the time. The anti-Semitism is but it's more like ignorant. It's not like, let me say something disparaging about Jewish people. It's more like, did Jesus have horns? Or you don't celebrate Christmas? Or sometimes they'll invite me to Bible study and I'm like, no, I'm Jewish and I don't want to do that. And they'll be like, and they try to save my soul. That's a big thing of like saving you.
Convert you back into Christianity.
Right. And then I say no, and I explain to them my point of view. And I say, well, I'm not here to talk about religion. Let's focus on what get back to the thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So I haven't had a problem with that. I just get, I would say questions out of curiosity. A lot of them have never met a Jewish person, let alone a brown Jewish person before. So they just have a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions. How does it work? And I grew up modern Orthodox. So I grew up Orthodox too, which is a whole other podcast to talk about. But I do know a lot of Torah and like Tanakh, and I'll sit and I'll talk. A lot of them know a lot about the Bible, and we'll talk about the Bible. And sometimes that's a way for me to melt the ice. Like, let's get you comfortable. We'll talk about some Bible talk, and and I like talking about it too.
Do they answer your questions in the end? Do they cooperate?
Yeah, I've never had a problem. Never had a problem. Where I have had the problem is in the Deep South, walking in Black communities, where in New York, I could, as a reporter, door knock anyone. They'll talk to me, complain about the police. It's one of the easiest parts of my job is what we call street reporting. In the Deep South was the first time I've experienced people being like, you're different. We're not going to talk to you. And I was like, what? That was interesting to me.
What do you do? How do you handle these situations as a journalist?
No, I was shut down. I was in Memphis, and it wasn't even like anything for me to handle. The first issue was I come from the North, and they are in the Deep South. So they have a very strong Southern accent where I had to keep saying, hey, can you slow down? Hey, can you repeat that word? And they were insulted. I wasn't trying to insult them. I just am like a New York kid, and I'm not good with the Southern twang. So again, America's a huge country. Sure. Depending where you go, people sound different, right?
And they immediately recognize where you come from. And if you are not their cup of tea, they won't cooperate. But in the end of the day, you want to get results. You want to write, you want to publish, you want to say what you want. So that's why I'm really interested to know, how do you deal with these situations? How do you get them to tell you what you want to hear in the end?
Well, what I try to do is work with like a local nonprofit worker, or work with a local church. Sometimes I've learned from that. Usually I will still work with the local church, but I try to do the first day by myself. Most journalists, I want to get a feel for the neighborhood or where the issue is. Let me go to that community. I want to see it for myself. In Memphis, it didn't work out that well, but lucky for me, I already was working with a local pastor who was already helping me find one of his employees to like take me back to the neighborhood. Wow. To walk around with me. And that's what we did. It's just, I just, for the first day, wanted to see what was going on, and went by myself, and it just got me nowhere. And it was sort of my first time of what we call striking out. I didn't get anyone to talk. But again, what I found interesting about going to the Deep South, coming from a mixed Jewish background, is number one, very few places have Jewish people. Number two, very few places have places where you have like two families get together, Chinese, Haitian, Jewish, Jamaican, whatever you want it to be, coming together and raising kids, and everyone's like, sure, that's normal. In Memphis, you were either black or you were white. I did not see a lot of diversity other than you were black or you were white. And that was it. So if you don't fit in those two boxes, and then you're coming with a very strong Jewish last name, and then you're coming from this thing called the Marshall Project, people are like, what? We're not the New York Times. We don't have that name recognition. Most people are like, who are you? But again, when I started working with someone who knew that neighborhood and they just took me around, oh, that's Simone, this is why she's here. And then people were like, oh, cool. So yeah, I was seen as an outsider. I wasn't offended by any neck of the woods. It's fine. It's more a lesson to me that I think, oh, New York, right? Oh, wait, I live in a bubble. Most of America is not like New York State.
Yeah, you're training it. You're becoming better and better. This is so what, and we're coming. We have to. Unfortunately, we are coming to an end. So, where just a question before the last question? What are the presents in your work that you say when you come back at the end of the day, when you come back home and you say, I love what I do? What are those?
Well, first, it's shedding light on problems that impact families. So I think for me, like on a small level, helping a family who got no attention. So here's a story, which I'm very proud to say, was presented before the Supreme Court. They're taking a case about abuse by federal agents who work in law enforcement. And the people who brought on that case to argue why it should go before the US Supreme Court, like my work was cited in the footnotes twice, 2 footnotes. Wow. Such nachas I have. But that story before the Supreme Court moment, what I had a lot of I could speak a little bit in Yiddish and Hebrew. What nachas I had for that was this poor mother, her son who had schizophrenia. This was an upper middle class black family in Atlanta who had enough money to hire their own private investigator as a reporter, which is great, and uncovered a lot of problems with her son's murder. And she wasn't getting any attention about it. And I found it. I was going through court cases and I found the case. I found her lawsuit and I called her up. And it's a really sad story about this young man who was mentally ill, and local police have issues. What we don't really talk a lot about is our federal police here in the US. And he was shot and killed by a federal task force. And although, because we got the court papers, they knew he had mental illness, they kicked down the door and shot him lots of times. Anyway, it's very disgusting and terrible what happened to him. Jamarian Robertson's his name. And his mother was getting nowhere with the lawsuit, not getting a lot of national attention. And I'm just happy for her that her case is impacting, hopefully, other laws. Like in America, if the Supreme Court hears something and they make a decision and it decides, the right way, it can impact a lot of families. So I'm hoping for her it does. Because she had a son with schizophrenia and the federal police didn't handle it well, basically.
I think first of all, that's wonderful what you do, and I think also that's part of the role of the journalist, to give voices to those who can't speak, who are not enough under, to shed a light on those who are in the dark. And I think that's definitely something worthwhile working for, and a life worthwhile living for, in a way. Last question, Simone, because we're really out of time, and I would like to know, when looking into the future, a few years into the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, which reform would you, if you would have the tools or the enough power to impact the police and have effect on the police, which of the reforms, what is the most important reform you would implement in the police that you would like to see happen?
Very good. Well, 2 things. One is police in America is still very much a blue collar job. Mm-hmm. And they don't, a lot of cities, they're not paid really well. So they're attracting people, sometimes GED, high school diploma. You're not getting people with graduate degrees who are bilingual. I would like it to become more of a white collar profession, which is very expensive to do, mm-hmm. but I think it needs to happen. It's too much of these tough macho men are taking on these jobs. In America, we're changing from that. And the second thing is the laws on the books need to start reflecting the population. Like, I think people are waking up that the laws aren't on their side when it comes to this stuff.
Not, yeah, and they're not.
Right. And we keep talking about policies, use of force. It doesn't matter until it's harder for easier for a police officer to be prosecuted. It doesn't matter what's on the books, because if they can't get in trouble for acting bad, they're going to still act bad, right?
Exactly. Simone, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us your thoughts and your work and your experience, and for letting us see through your eyes as a journalist living in the US today and covering such important issues like policing and law enforcement in such troubled times, where there are so many storms in the US today and all over the world, not only in the US, of course, but there is something happening right now there. And I want to thank you so much for letting us in for half an hour and giving us a bit of a view from your eyes of what is happening. Thank you so much for your time and for being here with us. And thank you very much for our listeners and for our viewers of today's program. And thank you all, and see you next time.
Right. Bye-bye. Thank you, Leitrovt.